Hello, everybody, and welcome to Sparing Partners. I'm Monica Paolini, your host. And with me today, I have Simon Fletcher, who is the Chief Strategy Officer at the Small Cell Forum and also the CEO of Real Wireless. Today, we're going to talk about is small cells and how concept of small cells, what small cells are evolving over time. I've been working on cells for a long time. And in fact, I started working where they were not even called small cells. I remember spending 1 week trying to figure out, should they be small cells or microcells or picocells or femtocells and whatever. And I think that now most commonly used word is small cells. However, what's happening also is that what small cell is a much broader set of things, for lack of a better word. So I would like to talk to Simon about this. And this is right after the Small Cell World Forum that was in London recently. And so we can talk about what we heard and saw there, which was quite interesting. So Simon, welcome to Sparing Partners, and tell us a little bit about who you are and how you ended up with becoming the Chief Strategy Officer.
Yeah, thanks, Monica. It's good to be doing this. I think we may have done a podcast before some time ago, but it's been a while, so good to be back. Maybe just a bit of context to help. As you say, I've been consultant for a number of years through the Real Wireless company. I'm the CEO of that outfit. Are independent of any particular industry, including the small cell industry, advising our clients from a neutral perspective on technologies and approaches. But, the Small Cell Forum is an organisation that I have dipped in and out of for a number of years, ever since I've been in the industry, which is over 25 years or so, and was first engaged when it was called the Femto Forum, working at that time as part of a company called a corporation, when we were looking at how to expand mobile technologies into different product lines, having developed 3G platforms. And the Femto Forum was formed in the 2007 timeframe, but that was very much in building coverage. It was one purpose, one focus, because in building coverage for mobile was a problem. And, so many years later, it's still a problem. And I was approached by the leadership of the Small Cell Forum a few years ago, 3 years ago, asked if I would take on a strategy officer role to help them navigate the next stages of the evolution of the forum. And importantly, as we're talking post Small Cell World Summit, of that event and how it could grow. Yes, I was pleasantly surprised when I dipped back into the forum after some time away, the diversity of discussions, but that's a double-edged sword. The reality is, when the forum was originally formed, it was quite anticipatory of a market. It was saying, this is a potential market. Operators were clearly saying, we have a problem with in-building. We're not reaching coverage where we need to be with our macro sites outdoor. How do we address the in-building? And there were a group of companies, mostly in the UK, but in other countries as well, who were developing technologies, products that could address. It's evolved from that into an extremely diverse set of use cases. I guess it's an occupational hazard of the small cell. It's there to fill the gaps where the macro wide area networks can't cover. And that is an occupational hazard. As I say, it just means that you're quite fragmented markets effect across many diverse users. That creates challenge, and so makes it an extremely interesting industry to be looking at and helping to steer a forum within.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, one of the best presentations at the meeting was from Yukat Okla, who is going to be on doing a podcast too, showing how bad indoor coverage is. He was specifically looking at London, but I think can just get, it's bad everywhere. And when you think about it, we talk a lot about rural coverage. And I think that we talk much more about rural coverage and indoor coverage, while I'm not saying that rural coverage is not important. However, most people are in indoor locations most of the time.
Yeah.
Indoor coverage is 80%. So it's not like rural, important as it is, involves a relatively small number of people. Indoor coverage is for all of us. So it always surprised me how little attention span we devote to that in the industry in general.
Yeah, I agree. It is a strange anomaly of a system. I think perhaps to some extent, credits to Wi-Fi in that it has created a level of coverage, service availability in buildings. I mean, that's to be fair to that technology ecosystem. They've got the price point right. They've got the products right for several years and been deploying Wi-Fi, and just sort of ticking along. And perhaps, that's done quite nicely. I know always, as I say, with my independent hat on, I can take a step back a little bit from the mobile ecosystem and say, what Wi-Fi's doing a nice job in many enterprise environments, and perhaps that has helped, keep the voices down a little bit. But you can see in some markets now, and I would point to, we got a strong message through the Small Cell World Summit, and we've heard it a number of times on the stage from a contingent that come. We run two conferences a year, one in London, which is our global event, and one down in Saudi Arabia, which we've done for the last couple of years, which is speaking more to the Middle East, North Africa market primarily, but there's some quite good global thought leadership there. The regulator, Saudi Arabia, is very clear. If you're building over 7-story buildings or to 7 and above, then you must have mobile coverage in your building. And the regulator heavily leaning in there and saying this is mandatory is changing the behavior of industry. In the US market, you can see it with emergency call requirements. So a lot of investment went into hotel sector and other places where emergency call using mobile technologies must be guaranteed. That creates emphasis. To some extent, it can be a bit piecemeal because that is a voice call, the US market I just cited, it's sort of voice call requirements. It would be nice if there was more requirement, just generic mobile broadband. And then, of course, as mobile technologies are evolving, the capability to have lower latency systems and ultra high throughput, uplink performance improvements, all these different capabilities are available in the toolkit of 3GPP. We're probably still quite early days on the nuance around on some of those capabilities and small cell and how mobile can play into those use cases and needs.
Actually, there was quite a lot of discussion at the meeting about the Saudi requirement. And so some people would say, well, how can you ask somebody to put indoor coverage as if it's like a weird thing? And it is unusual. I'll grant you that.
It is.
But we do have, sometimes with spectrum allocations, the requirement that you cover a certain percent of the population so those kind of requirements are not really new. I guess the difference here is that it's not the requirement is not on the operator but on the building owner.
Yes, exactly right. Yeah.
So let me just
yeah.
ask the thing is that you cannot ask me to do something unless you give me the tool to do it. So I need to have spectrum so that I can do it, because otherwise you create a situation where I have a new building. I want to put indoor coverage, but then I depend on the operator allowing me to do that. That creates a real problem because the operator might charge me whatever they want to charge me, or whatever the case may be. So
Yeah.
how should we think about that?
Well, I think it's a well-known problem in the industry. You can get to 90% coverage as sort of a, if you do sort of techno-economic or cost-based analysis, you can get your coverage going to 90% with a reasonably steady incremental investment capex line. And then you suddenly get this frightening curve as you get into the more difficult to cover areas, rural, and included in that bucket will be in building. And of course, the curve shape will change depending on what bits of spectrum you're talking about. Lower bands, you can get better in building penetration, but a lot of the small cell technologies generally are being placed into the higher than gig bands, and mid band spectrum is quite known to 3.x areas, N77, N78 like bands. So in those areas, yeah, you're looking for something that will fit nicely in the in-building coverage piece, and there will certainly be that there is a debate about who's going to cover the cost. I think it's very clear from the market analysis presentation that was given at the Small Cell World Summit by our content director Caroline. The enterprises are taking ownership of the small cell narrative in several markets, and they are willing to pay. They are willing to pay, and that takes the burden off the mobile operators to some extent. Of course, if the enterprise is requiring or expecting to have the signal of the mobile operator available, which they would in a sort of a neutral hosting like scenario rather than a private network, then there are deals that need to be done with mobile operators. Even if you're installing the system or paying for it, you still need to have that commercial relationship with operators, the national operators. But the dynamics are getting much more interesting. So in rural coverage, it's governments that are having to step in and help subsidise the industry to provide that coverage. UK shared rural network was a good example of that mindset. Of course, satellite guys are providing some of that coverage as well now. That's emerging. But for the in-building, yes, it's still very much, who's going to pay. And I say, well, we've seen a tipping point. The market analysis is showing clearly enterprises are building their confidence. They understand what these systems are. There are lots of complexities. I'll admit, it's not a plug and play necessarily, but it's going in the right direction in terms of capital investment from others than the mobile operators.
Yeah, and also it's much cheaper because every time you talk to somebody, either the operator or the enterprise. So if the operator has to go into a building, they have to put infrastructure. It's expensive. It's very distracting for them because how many buildings are out there? So it's a huge amount of places. But also they don't have access. They don't have the keys to the building. They need to. So there is the whole cost is so much higher. It just seems like, come on, guys, let's have the enterprise do it. I mean, it just seems like.
And I think that what that's really helping also is for the industry to move to more shared infrastructure discussions as well, because the enterprises don't want to be locked in to a single operator coverage solution. They're not going to subsidize a particular mobile operator over another in terms of extending their coverage. So it's almost like a given now that we need to be talking about shared operators, so a neutral host platform that can cover or has each of a proportion of each of the mobile operator spectrum available in the building through the in-building system, and then if the enterprise can see that is a part of the value proposition, then they're willing to pay for that. Now, a shared infrastructure system is still going to be more headline capex cost-wise higher than a single operator, but in terms of total cost of ownership and as I say, having the ability to trade off packages between the different operators, which would generally be done by a neutral host who is operating the network in the building for a mobile system. It can be done by the enterprise, but some choose to have an expert operator supplier provide the service. And you get a very interesting economics piece there, where say there may be an upfront cost which is slightly higher to get all operators in the building. Playing that out over a total cost of ownership period, your quids in if you're looking at subsidizing the extending of the coverage into the building of all the operators at the same time. That's the win-win for everyone ultimately.
Yeah. Another thing sort of linked to what you just said, that another message that I got from the meeting is how much activity there is in the Middle East. And you can say, well, they spend more time indoors than we do because there's some weather issue, there is less legacy, and there is a lot of money. Is that true?
I think
because it's not just a small cell. I mean, those countries are incredibly knowledgeable.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, we picked up on it because we had two board members from Saudi Arabia approached us 3 years ago or so and joined the forum and were saying that they wanted to be, informed and understanding the opportunities. There are interesting dynamics there around sovereign capability. So this is quite an interesting area, of course. In the markets in Saudi Arabia, as an example, is quite regulated in terms of you must have local partners if you're delivering into the market. So it's regulated in that sense. So what you tend to find is there is a good deal of trying to understand the technology and how some components can be developed or system integrated in market. So I guess why they were quite keen to join the forum, because within the detailed discussions within the small cell forum, there is a product components and solutions working group where we will go down and look into interfaces in the baseband. We call it FAPI. It's a sort of de facto standard in the baseband area of small cells now. Also thinking about chipset options, because whilst fully respecting the large US-based component vendors of GPU and CPUs, there is in reality, for a highly cost-optimized and performant baseband in a small cell, a winning ticket around customized silicon. That's an interesting area. So if you're interested, you have technical competent people, and Saudi Arabia surely does. There's quite a substantial uplift in filed patents in 5G and research ecosystem output from the Middle East in general. That indicate, and in particular around the sort of telecoms technologies. So you see a rapid learning in terms of how to put together these systems, and possibly a recognition that a small cell product and the solution that goes around it in terms of the core and any other components is a lower hanging fruit than building a macro base station from day one, which is actually a highly integrated and complex system. And as we know, there are in effect 3 vendors globally who compete at that level. In the small cell ecosystem, there are many vendors. In local markets, you need to have some economies of scale for sure, but it's actually a lower hanging fruit in terms of entering into that market and producing your own solutions and integrating various components from the global trade and supply. And so I can see Saudi Arabia as a market is very interesting in that there's a recognition that is a value proposition of the small cell ecosystem. It allows new entrants, and they're learning rapidly.
Yeah, and I think as you point out, it's not just the fact that they do have money. It just seems it's just an ecosystem that it's becoming more and more geared to effective innovation. and to innovate in a way that is different from the sort of the standard narrative of US
Yeah,
innovation, where you have
yeah,
Google,
totally.
AWS, that you have the big guys. And this is a very different path to innovate.
It is a different path, Monica, but actually, I mean, for me, I'm always fascinated by the impact of regulation and government, its steering on how innovations diffuse in the market. And you could argue that, those names that you've listed, those sort of large hyperscaler brands, they're operating at a level which is sort of almost above the level of regulation that they've managed to find an opportunity. Of course, we can see some governments are trying to catch up with them now, but in reality, the large data center investments and the ability to carry their services over networks of networks deployed by many different, not just the mobile operators, but all sorts of networks, has created that global scale. But in local, in market areas, the dynamic of how the regulator puts its emphasis on what it wants to see, and in particular, so as you say, look, the coverage dynamic, but we're seeing in some markets also regulators are saying we have a resilience requirement. Mobile is critical national infrastructure. And I don't think we'll see Wi-Fi get into that category, but mobile is definitely being anointed in several markets, especially in the European sense, as critical national infrastructure. And therefore, there is a reliability and availability component starting to come here, which is going to be very interesting in terms of how that steers and shapes industry and how they choose the features and develop the products to address those needs. And so I always find it fascinating, this area, in terms of how it interacts. And you've got many different buyers. The key point that I always pick up from the market analysis that Caroline does for the forum is when we started that market analysis, before my time in the forum, but I remember reading the reports, it was very much mobile operator, buyer driven sentiment. And that is how you established the growth trends. In the last 4 or 5 years, a third of the interviews are done with enterprise buyers. So it's a mixed buyer set across different enterprise verticals or industry sectors. Each of those buyers also shapes how the technology will emerge and the product development choices that the vendors and the system integrators will be focused on.
Absolutely. And, I think this is really interesting because people are talking more and more about resilience, reliability, availability. And I think it's actually a very good thing that we are shifting the narrative from just capacity, which is clearly, or even coverage, because you might have coverage and capacity, but if it's not reliable, well, what does it mean? So better than nothing, but that's not enough.
Yeah, totally. And I think that, as you mentioned it, and I'll call it out as well, the presentation from Ookla, from Luke at SCWS, is spot on in terms of trying to come up with consensus around what are the metrics. And yes, we can talk about coverage and we can give an impression about signal level. But as we know, the capacity dimension starts to speak to service availability. What services are being supported on this coverage signal? That you're seeing now, the tool sets, the analysts are moving from talking about just a simple coverage based on power level measured at a particular point to taking more measurements and understanding there are different types of service that are being consumed over these networks, and the quality of experience is important now. I think in the research domain, people have been talking about quality of experience and different metrics and KPIs for years. I actually feel like industry is starting to grapple with how do you do that. Another presentation I liked at the Small Cell World Summit this year was the one from VMO2, which I don't know whether you will know, Monica, because you were chairing the session, the panel that discussed it. But I mean, that was talking about, I think the metric was 8 out of 10 users who were connected to small cells. There was an uplift in terms of their satisfaction with the quality of service and the different use cases that they were using. So the message from VMO2 was clear. They are seeing a return on the investment in their small cell layer. This is nothing to do with in building. This is an outdoor story supplementing their macro network. But they were seeing the metrics, the feedback, what they were hearing from their customers. When they were receiving service on a small cell layer, it was better. And that's, so they're increasing their footprint of their small cells, leaning into where those quality of service, quality of experience areas are important in stadiums or wherever. They're different places where suddenly you can say, right, okay, the macro is doing the heavy lifting. It gives us our baseline of coverage. But if we really want to peak up on that quality of experience, then small cell investment, we need that complementary layer to the macro layer to be deployed to make a difference.
Yeah, and that presentation was good because I think it also calls the attention to the quality of experience. So we used to think of, does my network support, say, online gaming, an application? But that doesn't necessarily mean much for the user. And so some people start talking about perceived quality of service, which is not necessarily latency per se, or I mean, obviously latency and capacity affected, but it's more than that. It's how I find the service to be for me, which is it's not entirely subjective, but there is a big element of subjectivity, and there's a lot of things that go into that. Now,
yes, certainly.
Now, let me ask you another sort of interesting food for thought from the meeting is that your definition of what is a small cell, which is everything that is not a macro. And that's interesting because initially, the whole small cell movement was trying very hard to distinguish itself from the competition, so to say, the alternatives. And so DAS was the enemy, passive DAS. And now there is active DAS, which is a completely different animal than passive DAS, but that is basically considered a small cell. So, and I guess what that points is to the fact, and the other thing is that private 5G or private networks are basically small cell networks. So how should we think about small cells? It's not just the size of the thing. It's also the architecture behind it.
Yes,
I mean, clearly they're smaller than a macro, but macro are also getting smaller. So how should we think about it?
Yeah, I mean, this is a classic. So I think from a forum perspective, you're always working in a constructive ambiguity, I would say. I mean, that's a way to frame it, to say there's, it's member-led. And at the end of the day, a lot of our members have over time merged their small cell and DAS product lines. So we at the Small Cell World Summit were saying we are serving the small cell and DAS industries. So we're quite clearly focused still on the radio element to some extent. So you said we're still looking at that final hop from the network into the device. But we're less precious in terms of a particular product concept. When it was the Femto Forum, it was very clear. We could just draw a picture of a small Wi-Fi box and say, we want one like that, but with mobile instead of Wi-Fi inside. That's fine. We're now into a diversified industry where particular vendors are able to lift and shift that component and that expertise, which is embedded in that ASIC or that software, from one product line to another. So we find in the forum that we are talking, and we've done 2 papers over the last 18 months on NTN, for example. Why are we talking as a small cell forum about NTN? The answer is because the baseband processing, the skill set required to develop a highly energy efficient and performant baseband is much the same, the engineering competence, as what you would do for NTN payloads versus what you can do on the ground in a terrestrial network scenario in a small base station. So our members who are baseband processing oriented are saying, well, this is small cell technologies. Small cell technologies can go into these different product lines. And I'm, say, fine, okay, we'll flex the definition of the small cell forum a little bit. But ultimately, if we're talking to a traditional mobile operator, and we have a few of those members who would be, constraining me and saying, our definition of a small cell. I mean, they're generally, it's very clear it has to have a 3GPP related component to it. So it's about 3GPP as it defined RF related characteristics. It's got to be able to launch those 3GPP compliant signals, send and receive. But the rest of it, I mean, what do we mean by small? So something that's small and compact, okay, relatively small power. So there are perhaps slightly less restrictions in terms of where it can be deployed. At a macro base station power level, you have a lot of clearance requirements because they're blasting out watts of energy. You can't walk close to a macro base station. There are some exposure limit requirements. So small cells are trying to be small enough power, so those exposure limit expectations are slightly lower, so they can be deployed more flexibly at street level and shopping level, whatever. But the form factor is important, so it's got to be small. And generally, we're talking about smaller coverage areas. A small coverage area like in building is, everything in building is small cell. That's clear. Campus networks, we've seen, certainly with my real wireless hat on, I've seen campus networks that are all small cell. There's no macro tower launching anything. It's all been small cell oriented deployments. And then when you get to the wide area, you're looking for complementary. The mobile operators are looking at complementary layers. So as I say, they've got their macro layer, which is doing some heavy lifting, and they've got their capacity oriented investment to build that out, transitioning to 5G standalone networks over time. And then you've got the small cell layer, which is addressing different places. And we are also including in the definition of small cell forum areas of interest what we're calling a mini macro. So we're encroaching on the macro layer, but it's about the packaging. It really comes then down to the mechanical engineering of where you can actually deploy this thing, and you don't require heavy civil engineering to support the weight and the installation of the base station. This is much more hidden in the environment, like product lines. So yeah, we're quite flexible on small cell in that sense. It's about product, solutions, and networks, and being agile at those sort of 3 levels of abstraction in terms of what do we mean by small cell. And that gives us plenty of degrees of freedom for our vendor members who like to innovate in terms of how they diversify their revenues across the different network opportunities.
Yeah, and actually, I did a podcast with Ben Droppingle at Andrew, where we really talked about how the path was from passive DAS, small cells, to active DAS, and it's actually quite interesting because there is the element of the factor, but also the element of how you manage a
Yeah,
large network, which is
absolutely.
somewhat separate because you can have the same kind of small form factor, but how do you manage it depending on the size of the venue?
Yep.
Now, I want to push you, however, one step further. And if a small cell is everything that is not a macro, why do you need to confine yourself to 3GPP? Why not add the Wi-Fi to it? Because Wi-Fi, I mean, private networks, well, I mean, Wi-Fi are the major private networks. So would you,
Yeah, I mean,
why not?
it's a very good. We have over the forum over the years has done quite a lot of collaborative work with the Wi-Fi industry through the Broadband Alliance, Wireless Broadband Alliance, and others. And there are members over the years who have looked at various ways of integrating a Wi-Fi platform with a mobile in more or less seamless ways. I, it, it's it's a perennial it definitely is a perennial discussion in the industry, as you know. It's where do we go with this one, Wi-Fi versus the mobile thing. The industry resolves that ultimately in terms of the commercial case and the way different industry players are comfortable in terms of their business models. The business model for a Wi-Fi based system is different from the way we're talking about small cell and this neutral hosting function. There's an understanding that we are moving over time to zero touch, zero trust. You can see that coming through the narrative in 6G when people are talking about what's 6G going to be. And I'm always a little bit negative on talking about 6G from a commercial and trade association perspective. The Small Cell Forum sees 6G as still a interesting conversation happening over there, but it's not generating revenue. So we watch it, and we have an activity within the forum to make sure that we're on top of the developments and steering and helping to shape. But ultimately, it's got to be about the 5G story for me, and making sure that we are, delivering on the value proposition. The industry struggles to make money out of 5G. I think the return on investment is still not great. So we are, Wi-Fi can do Wi-Fi's thing. And I think that, I haven't looked at the figures recently commercially for Wi-Fi, but I'm sure they're making sensible return on investment. So the 5G industry, 4G, 5G, they're now focused their efforts on the 5G platform. And integration with Wi-Fi perhaps complicates the business case or creates a narrative that is less clear in some regards. So at this point, they're a separate story. Over time, it could well be, and that could be driven by the standards bodies. I know there are TDocs. I've seen them in 3GPP discussions for the pathways to 6G. We need to have another discussion about how to integrate Wi-Fi into the mobile architecture. Let's see. That's been the discussion every generation. And we have tightly coupled architectures and loosely coupled architectures and architecture diagrams coming out of our ears each generation as they go along. Maybe 6G will prove to be different, but at the moment, they're treated very much as different business lines and different value propositions.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that they can physically coexist in the same building, in the same venue, but doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be really tied together. I mean, we've been, since the beginning, there's been attempts of getting 3GPP and Wi-Fi to talk to each other more closely, and it just, there has been a lot of progress, but they are separate. And I think that there is some value to the fact that they are separate.
Absolutely. I don't see. Yeah, totally. So with my real wireless hat on, I mean, we when we're advising in the stadiums area, I mean, there are still, once you've worked out all the different use cases for wireless connectivity, including public safety systems and all the various needs around a stadium and the blue light services connectivity and all those different aspects of operating a safe environment, as well as the fan engagement and all the different. You can quite easily identify 3, 4, 5 wireless systems that are special purpose towards those different use cases with different budget pots and different investment cycles in terms of how often they should be refreshed, different expectations around reliability, whether they're mission critical or not, etc. So having separation of wireless systems in a portfolio-based approach is actually the right way to go. If you have a single platform, one point of failure architecture, and everything integrated for all use cases, for all users, in some places, you're putting too many eggs in one basket, frankly. And you do need to be thinking about that as part of the strategy. So these different wireless technologies and the platforms and how they're deployed, I don't see a future where they all become unified into one thing. I think there's too many dynamics there, including industry competition between different vendors and whatever else, that will mean that unifying everything under one thing, I think we're going to struggle to get there ever.
Yeah, and it's a good thing. Keep it separate because you want to have more, and you're going to have more innovation, more availability of service. Simon, thank you so much for this conversation. It's great, and I think it's going to be especially valuable. I learned a lot, but I think that especially the people that were not at the meeting in London, unfortunately for them, they can catch up and find out everything that it's new in the small cells, because I think there's a lot of changes. It's not the standard view of the small cells, like the small thing you put up and it saves money. It's way, way more than that.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for your support at the conference this year, Monica. It was much appreciated. And I'm glad you enjoyed it. I always find it a fascinating conference in that sense, in that it's quite a diverse set of people who attend. As I say, lots of innovators who are looking at various niche market opportunities in all sorts of different vertical industries and different architectures, and long may the sort of heterogeneous, innovative environment survive. I think it's great for the industry to have that diversity.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously it's not the size of Mobile World Congress, which is what actually makes it so much more rewarding in a way, because there is so much difference in there, because everybody's looking at small cells from a slightly different point of view. So not everybody, it's not the same business model for everybody. So
totally.
Well, thank you so much, Simon, and to the next one.
Yeah, lovely. Thanks, Monica. Good to be here.
And thank you all for listening, and keep listening to us and tell your friends about it.